The last will and testament of Adolf Hitler is a document that suspends in time the delusions of the Führer's final days for all to see. Written on the 29th of April 1945, the day before his death, the document is split into two parts: a personal will, in which Hitler lays out who he would like to inherit his paintings, and a testament in which he rages against the world. Hitler refuses to take the blame for World War II, saying that the conflict had been the last thing he wanted. He blames the Jews all the way to his dying breath, of course, but most interestingly, he sets out his vision for what the future of Nazi Germany should look like in his absence. Even hidden away in his bunker with enemy forces surrounding him in all directions and his own men abandoning him, Hitler still held on to his Nazi fantasy. In the testament, he names the cabinet of men he wishes to take over the running of the party and the country. One of the names that stands out the most on the list was the name of the man chosen to replace Hitler himself as the commander-in-chief of the German army, a man nicknamed the Monster in Uniform by his own men, Ferdinand Shaer. Schörner's actions during the war were notorious, and not for the reasons you might expect. Whilst most Nazi officers were feared for the atrocities that they committed on enemy soldiers and civilians, Schörner was infamous for his treatment of his own men. Hitler's paranoia had taken over completely in his final days in the bunker. He trusted nobody, not even long-standing comrades Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring. So why was it that he trusted Schörner to command the German army? And why did Schörner betray Hitler just days later? This is the story of Bloody Ferdinand. Ferdinand Schörner did not fit the mold. In many ways, he was much like Hitler. Like the Führer, Schörner was not born into wealth. He was born into a normal lower middle-class family in Munich in 1892. As a result, not much is known about his early life. For all intents and purposes, he lived a very unremarkable life. That is, until the war. Schörner defined himself as a military man right from the start, joining the Bavarian army in October 1911, several years before the outbreak of World War I. He started quite literally at the bottom of the ladder, serving as a one-year volunteer in the Bavarian Light Regiment. But by the time the war broke out, he had climbed to the rank of Leutnant der Reserve. Perhaps the one thing that started to put his name on the map was his involvement in the Battle of Caprese. In 1917, the Italians were holding the line near the Isonzo River in the north. From there, they had been launching repeated attacks on the German and Austro-Hungarian forces for almost 2 years with a fair amount of success. The Germans needed a counterattack to snuff out the threat. What followed was one of the most decisive battles in the First World War. A wave of German and Austro-Hungarian forces marched onto the land around the river, armed with flamethrowers and grenades. With quick flanking and aggressive tactics, they were able to land a brutal victory against the Italians. On the 24th of October, the offensive really kicked into gear, catching the Italians off guard. On that day alone, the Germans were able to advance 25 kilometers. After a month, the Italians had been pushed back almost all the way to Venice and had lost almost 700,000 men in the process. 40,000 had been killed or wounded, 280,000 captured, and the remaining 350,000 deserted. And Ferdinand Schörner was on the ground to see it all. In this offensive, he not only realized the importance of a strong and unified attacking line, but he also saw how badly the Italians capitulated as their men abandoned their posts. An army full of deserters crumbles in a matter of days. If he was ever in charge, he would make sure that that would never happen. But Schörner had a long way to go before that would happen, for he was now just a common soldier. Once the dust settled on the Battle of Caprese, however, he was called up for an award. His own role in the fight had not gone unnoticed. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite military order, nicknamed the Blue Max, a blue star that had been given out since 1740. At the time, it was the highest honor of bravery for a German soldier. Schörner had found his place, so now with the war over, it was time to start climbing the ranks again. With his Blue Max, he'd be able to stand out from the competition and leapfrog over the aristocrat boys above him. But Schörner had a rival, a man named Erwin Rommel. Rommel was Schörner's polar opposite. Schörner believed in discipline. He was not there to be liked by his men. He was there to keep them in line. Orders would come down from the top, and he would fulfill them with military precision and ruthlessness. To him, Rommel looked soft. Rommel enjoyed having a good relationship with his own troops. He was both respected and liked by them, cutting the figure of a charismatic and empathetic leader. Any prisoners of war taken under him were to be treated with respect and dignity. What was more, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. If an order came down from above that he disagreed with, he would push back. To Schörner, this man was everything wrong with the military. He simply had to get on top. And the competition was fierce. In the years between the wars, the Treaty of Versailles was in full effect. It put massive constraints on the German military, severely limiting the number of troops that they could have serving. Many career soldiers lost their jobs in this period, but Schörner, with his Blue Max, was able to stay in the army, as well as join the right-wing paramilitary group Freikorps. With the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, Schörner found himself pulled in two directions. Officially, he served the Reichswehr, the name of the military at the time, and so he had duties to fill, but he could see the direction that the tide was turning in the country. He climbed the ranks to be the adjutant to General Otto von Lossow in 1923, just as the turning point happened. Hitler's men enacted the infamous Beer Hall Putsch, where they attempted a coup d'etat on the Weimar Republic. Schörner, being on the side of the Weimar Republic, was part of the reason the coup failed. But he decided in the following months that this was to be the last time he resisted Adolf Hitler. In the mid-1920s, he became an official member of the Nazi Party, despite still holding on to his military credentials. He was serving a government that he no longer believed in or stood for, and so when Hitler and the Nazis finally took power in 1933, he was positioned in the perfect place to capitalize. Just 1 year later, Schörner landed a hefty promotion. He jumped all the way up to the rank of Major and gained a spot on the general staff. He was poised on the edge of greatness now. All he needed was an opportunity to prove himself. Schörner knew he had an edge on the other officers, something that Hitler himself would surely notice sooner or later. The German general staff had a history of being dominated by the aristocracy, whilst the Wehrmacht, for the most part, was a meritocracy. Old Prussian families with money and influence had a huge say over the military, and they could easily pick out their own for its top spots. To climb to the rank of general without any kind of family background was virtually unheard of. Rommel, Schörner's longtime rival, fit the mold perfectly. Schörner did not. But what once had been a weakness stood out as a marked advantage for him. Hitler was not an aristocrat. The Führer had played along with the aristocratic games, getting them on side with his rule by promising increased budgets, power, revenge from the First World War, and whatever else. But he did not like these men. He was from a similar background to Schörner himself. Hitler didn't want a general staff dominated by people born into it. He wanted the best of the best. Schörner had a shot to prove himself. So in 1938, when the war erupted, Schörner was ready and waiting. The year prior, he had been put in charge of the 98th Mountain Regiment as their Oberstleutnant. His men were right in the thick of the action from the word go. They were in Poland during the initial offensive, and then in France and Belgium straight after that. Schörner was once again proving his value to Hitler. His firm hand and strict control over his men allowed them to play a key role in all three offensives. He earned another promotion, this time cracking to the very top tier of the German military, achieving the rank of general. If you look at his record throughout the Second World War, you'll see that he was all over the place, moved from front to front with consistent, solid results. His next station was in Greece, where he was part of the devastation of one of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe. Salonica, otherwise known as Thessaloniki, featured in the New Testament in the Bible. 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians were both letters written by Paul to the early church in the city, primarily made up of Jews. The city had been a home for them for centuries before and since, all the way up to the Second World War. It was estimated to have around 50,000 Jews living there, the largest Jewish population in all of Greece. But the city became a target for the Nazis. Their now allies, the Italians, were at war with the Greeks and attempted to invade and occupy the country. So Italy, Bulgaria, and Germany all attacked Greece from various angles and divided the country up between them. One area that was proving difficult was the north of the country. The German military command knew that if they could cut Salonica off from the rest of Greece, it would help them massively. So Schörner, in charge of the 6th Gebirgsdivision at this point, did just that. The city was taken and the Jewish population decimated. Centuries of Jewish tradition, culture, and heritage were destroyed. The population was forced into ghettos as the Nazis took over the running of the city. Thousands of men were taken to forced labor camps, and the Nazis demanded a ransom to be paid for their release. The Jewish community ended up having to sell the land of their Jewish cemetery to the Nazis to pay the price, while the Nazis then destroyed all of the headstones and built a university on the land. Over 45,000 Jews were deported from the city over the course of the war, most of them gassed, and by the end of the war, the Jewish population of Salonica had fallen from 50,000 to under 2,000. For Schörner's part in taking the city and his role in the conquest of Athens, he received the Knight's Cross. Almost every front in World War II was home to Schörner at some point. He was part of Operation Barbarosa in 1941, where the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. He was then in Finland in 1942 as the General der Gebirgstruppe in charge of the 19th Mountain Corps. Here we get a glimpse into the kind of military leader Schörner was and perhaps some of the reasons why Hitler grew to like him so much. Unlike the commanding officers of World War I, famous for hiding miles from the front lines in relative ease and comfort, Schörner was right there in the thick of it. One report from his time in Finland even tells the story of him engaging a Soviet soldier in hand-to-hand combat. Schörner was present on the battlefield, enforcing strict discipline in his men, no matter how much they hated him, and many did. Schörner was not well liked by those around him, be they foot soldiers or generals. As his troops moved into the USSR's territory, he took things to an extreme. The command from on high was to enact martial law on any Russian territory they took, a prospect where Schörner relished. He's reported to have shot dogs dead simply because their barking annoyed him. Whilst on the Arctic front, Schörner's believed to have committed a number of war crimes, according to the Soviets. He stayed in the north a little while longer, assuming the rank of Generalleutnant and taking charge of the Mountain Corps Norway before moving to the Eastern Front. In charge of the 40th Panzer Corps over Christmas in 1943, he was then given Army Group A, then Army Group South Ukraine, where we get our first glimpse into his true character. For all of Schörner's harsh discipline and strict orders over his men, he himself was a coward at heart. Stationed in Sevastopol, a port in Crimea, he was fighting a losing battle. Enemy forces were squeezing his men further and further back into a corner. The odds of the war were starting to turn against Germany, and this was the first time that Schörner had really come up against an insurmountable challenge. He contacted Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, the head office in charge of the military. He explained the desperate situation they were in and requested a retreat out through the port to safety. Hitler denied the request. The command from high was simple: fight to the last. Schörner took the command to heart. They would fight to the last. He instituted even stricter punishments for deserters. Any officer that was seen to be a defeatist would be shot dead. He had to strike fear into his men. They couldn't crumble the way the Italian army had crumbled all those years ago when he'd won the Battle of Caprese. And yet, no matter how much he tried to strike fear into the hearts of his men, they were more afraid of impending defeat. And that fear started to trickle into Schörner's heart too. There was nothing for it. He gave the retreat order, a direct violation of Hitler's orders. For most of the men, the command came too late. The retreat was a slaughter, and they ended up losing far more soldiers than they would have if they retreated earlier. Schörner left the conflict with a lot to reflect on. History repeated itself almost immediately, as his next assignment was to oversee the retreat of Nazi soldiers from the Dniester River in Romania. The tide of the war had definitely shifted now. The soldiers on the ground were all noticing it too. Nerves spread throughout the German army. Could they be about to lose this war? In his next position, it was the same story again. He was sent back north to take charge of the Army Group North and coordinate their retreat through the Baltics. Once again, they ended up trapped, this time penned against the Baltic Sea in Latvia. Schörner did as much as he could with what he had. Their defense was effective, staving off the Soviet onslaught for much longer than anyone expected, but it could only last so long. He turned to Hitler once again to request permission to retreat, and much to his surprise, Hitler granted it this time. The retreat order was given, but not everyone made it out. A good portion of the troops remained trapped there, where they kept fighting all the way to the end of the war. Schörner was not one of them. He'd been given a shiny new role, the biggest and best yet. He was being promoted to Field Marshal. To this day, Schörner is the most recent Field Marshal in the German military, as they retired the role after the end of the war due to its ties with Nazism. He was now in charge of the biggest and most important group in the whole German army, Army Group Center. It was his job to defend Czechoslovakia, the River Oder, and Silesia. Things again weren't looking good. They were to fall back from there. If they were to fall back from there, they would have nowhere to go but Berlin. Hitler refused to give retreat orders, again calling for the soldiers to fight to the last man. At this point in the war, the situation was desperate. Hitler had drafted the Volkssturm to try to fend off the enormous Red Army. The Volkssturm was a last-ditch wave of reinforcements composed of old men and young boys. The conscription ages were lowered to 16 and raised to 60, meaning men were now arriving on the front who were barely fit for service. It's here that we see the worst of Ferdinand Shaer, the period in which the nickname Monster in Uniform was cemented. He refused to entertain any possibility of desertion among his troops. Any man who was found behind the front line without written permission was to be executed without exception. Some were shot in the head, but Schörner preferred a more public show of cruelty. According to Joseph Goebbels, He would have deserters hung from the nearest trees or lampposts, with a sign around their neck saying, "I am a deserter. I have declined to defend German women and children, and therefore I have been hanged." Goebbels loved the approach. The way he saw it, the men now had the choice between the possibility of being killed on the front line or the inevitability of being killed away from it. There aren't exact numbers on how many were killed in this manner during this period, but estimates put it in the hundreds. The worst part was that a large proportion of those soldiers were not deserters. Men who were on legitimate orders from senior officers or simply lost were caught up by the roaming bands of patrolling officers and executed. Schörner was routinely executing his own men just to keep them fighting a losing position, like a trapped animal eating his own leg. The longer the war dragged on, the more extreme Schörner's punishments became. On one of the days, he came across a group of soldiers who were standing around waiting for orders. Incensed at the men for taking a moment to rest, Schörner immediately ordered their execution. The crime that was listed for their deaths was standing around without orders, with the eventual intent to desert. It was during this period that Hitler died. The war was over, German troops were surrendering left, right, center. And yet Schörner's men fought on, not wanting to be captured by the Soviets because of the horror stories that had come back from their prisoners of war. Schörner decided to have his forces fight toward the west. If they could work their way over to the American forces, they could surrender to them. That was the plan, until Schörner vanished. One night at 3 a.m., his small personal plane took off from a tiny airstrip. It was just him and a pilot on board. Without any warning, any orders for his men, any apology, Schörner had deserted. The one crime that he had punished for more brutally than anyone else. The crime that had been the death sentence of hundreds of his own officers. Schörner's plane flew to Austria initially. Schörner had always traveled in full military uniform, decked out in the usual medals and flashy Hugo Boss coat that epitomized the Nazi leadership. But this time was different. He ditched the uniform entirely, choosing instead to travel in a normal black business suit. The OKW did not receive any correspondence from him about the flight, either before takeoff or once he was in Austria. They had no clue where he'd gone. That is, until the Americans apprehended him. It seems that Austria was not to be Schörner's final destination. It was still very unsettled, with both Soviets and Americans crawling all over. Schörner was most likely stopping off there before traveling on somewhere more covert, but he never got the chance. The US held him until 1951 while they figured out what to do. In the end, they decided to turn Schörner over to the Soviets. Most of his time in the war had been spent on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviet forces, so it made sense for his fate to be left up to them. The Soviets came down on Schörner harder than many, but still very light considering the weight of his crimes. By the end of his trial, he was given 25 years. And yet, only 3 years into his sentence, Schörner found himself being moved again. Germany was on the rebuild, split into East and West. So Schörner was transferred to the communist East Germany, but he'd barely landed there before they shipped him over to the West. West Germany had requested that they get Schörner specifically, as he was wanted for war crimes against his own men. They charged him with the manslaughter of German soldiers and found him guilty. But perhaps the most shocking part of the story is how little time he served. Nazi senior officers almost all got away with their actions in the war. Many escaped prosecution entirely, and those who were charged often got much smaller sentences than you would expect. Schörner was no different. West Germany sentenced him to only 4.5 years. By 1963, Schörner, at the age of 71, was released. For the rest of his life, he kept a low profile. He gave one interview with an Italian publication, but only spoke about his service in the First World War and refused to touch on the Second. 10 years later, in 1973, he died as the last German field marshal, with the most prestigious medals in German history to his name. Now check out Hitler's plans for USA if he won, or watch this video instead.